we already have spoken about how our regions build, right? And I think we have to take into account also visual representations of regions. And if you look at this map here, I mean, the region I'm going to speak about, the Pribалтийский край, I mean, you can see quite easily why it is a region, because of the different combination of inhabitants. I'm going to do this very quickly because Paul promised to be very strong. And in fact, I wanted to do a kind of broader introduction into the topic, but I just want to draw your attention to the final point, and this makes the question I'm addressing in my presentation very obvious. In an age of nationalism, the question was very urgent to be discussed and debated. The tricky relationship between the idea of a nation on the one hand and the idea of a multinational empire on the other hand. So for the government, it was really a decision to be resolved. Should the government continue with the traditional alliance of aristocracies, which have been quite successful in administrating the region for centuries? All the bad things were left for the Baltic Germans to do, and as far as the region was kept quiet, everything was regarded to be okay. But with the appearance of the category of nation as a new element of how to manage diversity in a multinational empire, the situation became quite complicated, and the question arose how to guarantee the loyalty of non-Russian subjects if ethnic qualities are being popularly regarded as the only possible marker of loyalty. And I'm not going to speak about Russification. This is basically addressed to a Baltic audience, because I always have problems with this term, Russification, because, as you can read from the slide, contemporaries understood this term really quite differently. And so how can we use this term without ever really explaining what is behind it? So I'm not going to speak about this broader here, but what I'm going to outline to you is another kind of Russification that was the result of this reorientation of how to explain and how to legitimize Russian power in non-Russian regions. One of the possible ways of coming to terms with this problem was to redefine and reconceptualize the region in question, basically making this region more Russian, at least on the mental map of representatives of the Russian elite. And one clear symbol of this kind of mental Russification, mental appropriation of this region was this topographic change. The region for centuries had been called Pribалтийский край, which is, of course, a non-Russian word describing a region where the German elites were governing already for centuries. And this term created the image of a region that maybe even was allowed to be apart and foreign. And this is, of course, becoming really complicated in the new environment in the age of nationalism. And so the invention of the term Pribалтийский край changed also the direction of how this region was being perceived. Pribалтийский край was a Russian term, and it meant the perspective from the center to the borderland, the region at the coast of the Baltic Sea. It was not Zachutski, which would be also possible in a way. He was so interested in law. And this was just this more or less obvious symbol of that something had changed in the perception of the region. I have two short quotations demonstrating that, as a rule, the Russian society was not very aware of what was going on in the Baltic provinces. The first quotation from the 1830s, Fedej Bulgarin, one of those people who really introduced the story of the region to the Russian reading public. And in this quotation, you simply understand that the reading public was expected to know Saxony quite well, but they didn't have any clues about Livland, right? And the same is true for another observation by a deputy to the State Duma from Riga, Sergei Mansaryov, writing in the early 20s his memoirs, and he just claimed that in the State Duma nobody could do any differences between the Estonians and Latvians. On the other hand, people at least knew that it was not a German region, but it was an Estonian and Latvian. And in this quotation from Konstantin Arseniev, Marina already mentioned this famous geographer, you can see the traditional view of the Russian center of the Baltic provinces. It was the most treasured possession of the empire, and basically it was this German governed region that ultimately made the empire a genuine European empire. And this was the major importance of this region from an imperial perspective. But how can this be if you judge this idea from the perspective of nationalism? So this was the moment when people started to rethink the relationship between the center and the empire. And it was in the same year, in 1848, that Yuri Samarin wrote his famous letters from Riga, which were not published during his lifetime, but they circulated as a kind of samizdat in the circles of the Russian elites. And in these letters from Riga, Samarin, in a way, invented this the Russian quality of regional history and the territory as such. And he brought forward basically 4 arguments in order to substantiate this claim. The first is geographic argument, and this shows how easy it is to redefine regions. For him, there were simply no natural borders between Russia proper and the Baltic provinces, and thus it is a part of the great Russian plain. And so, quite naturally, естественно, it belongs to the Russian Empire. This argument was shared also by Baltic Germans at that time. So here we cannot really see this kind of conflict. This was something that was regarded to be quite natural in whole Europe. More controversial was this historic argument, because he claimed that prior to the Catholic Crusade in the early 13th century, there had been a process of assimilation between the Russians and the tribes of the Baltic, the later Baltic provinces, already for 1.5 centuries. And so he introduced the idea that historically, at least in theory, this region could have been a Russian territory, if not for the onslaught of the German intruders. This translated very easily into an argument from religion. Samarin argued, and he was not alone in this, that in fact the region was baptized not from the west, but already from the east, since the times of Yaroslav the Wise. And this religious argument was being enhanced by recent developments in the Baltic provinces. Because in the 1840s, we have a huge wave of conversions from the Protestant faith to the Tsar's faith, to Orthodox. Around 100,000 Estonians and Latvians converted to the Tsar faith, and this was exactly the period when Samarin was working in Riga. He was a witness of this process. and this may have inspired his thesis. Most interestingly, he created out of this a kind of moral obligation for Russia to carry out a kind of civilizing mission also in the Western provinces. Not only in the East, this was quite a natural thing, but out of these arguments, he took the legitimation for a Russian cultural mission also coast of the Baltic Sea. In contrast to the Germans, but the role of the Germans had been almost criminalized in this perspective, thanks to his writings. So the results of this mental appropriation, which took kind of decades to really have any kind of real impact, and it became visible more or less during the press debates between Baltic Germans on the one hand and Russians on the other in the 1860s. The Baltic provinces in a way became kind of testing ground for ideas of reconceptualizing Russian national policy in order to prevent that this region somehow is going to become German in the near future. It was the time of German reunification in 1871, so this was one of the major ideas for this German-Slavic historic controversy. You just have to read Danilevsky in order to understand the background. So the idea that there is some kind of region in the Russian Empire is completely foreign, lacks reforms, was very broadly shared in the media also in the 70s, and even the Western Europe continuously promoted the idea of reforms in the region. But reforms were carried out only under Alexander III, the famous period that has become the story of Russification, Estonian, Latvian, and Baltic German. What was somehow a completely different story was the way how the provinces were being portrayed in ethnographic literature, era studies literature in the 1870s, from the 1870s onwards, which were directed to the growing masses of the Russian reading public. In this literature, you have these kind of romanticized pictures of Estonians and Latvians, stories of peasant population full of superstition that were taken basically out of the German Enlightenment literature from the late 17th and 18th century, and thus were completely outdated. They did not speak about realities in the provinces anymore. So some of the contradictions of these two perspectives of the Baltic provinces, the actual policy was still continuing this kind of alliance of aristocracies between the Baltic Germans on the one hand and the Russian government on the other. And this position was reinforced after the revolutions of 95-96. The reality of the Baltic superstitious peasants was that they were almost all literate. We know that from census from 1897. And among these populations, nationalist or socialist convictions became increasingly popular. And so my rhetoric question at the end, why should anybody be concerned about the national and political aspirations of peasants whose favorite entertainment was swinging in the case of Estonians and solving riddles in the case of Latvians? I leave Rosanna out, come to my conclusions. So the invention of this Russian Baltic region went, of course, along with the idea and the hope to de-Germanize the entire region and to win the local majorities, the Estonians and Latvians, for the Russian cause. But this was in sharp contradiction to the realities And, okay, let's stop here.
Я бы сказал, что если хочешь что-нибудь сказать в самом конце, пожалуйста. Просто там это признак того, что там не думаешь, что кажется такой строгий руководитель. Я прилетел через один конверт и один океан, а я должен выполнить свою функцию.
The only thing I really would like to add was the in the result of what was happening in the region during 1905 and 1906, that a new kind of stereotyping process started in the minds of the Russian reading public, that from now on, in a way, the Estonians and the Latvians took simply over the role of the Germans as being a threat to the multinational empire as such, because from that period onward, we have the stereotype of Estonians and Latvians as either potential separatists who want to create something of their own, or as socialists.